Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa Valiuco, and welcome to Personal Pans, conversations about belief, transformation, and all the weird and wonderful things that we experience. Today's guest is Dash Kwiatkowski, one of the co-hosts of the podcast Psychic Friendz. On Psychic Friendz, Dash and their friend Rosa will go through free psychic advice Facebook groups and find questions and answer them. They ended up talking about their podcast, doing a live episode of the podcast at Witches Fest, which was the source of some controversy because a Christian group tried protesting. We also talked about a lot of my favorite things. Anime was the first one. I got very excited about that conversation. But we also talked about what it's like to try to connect with your ancestors when you feel alienated through social forces, through personal trauma. How do you explore? How do you access that? And then we also talked about a lot of things, but we also had a really interesting conversation about what it means to be a good person. I enjoyed the heck out of this conversation, and I hope you do as well.
I accidentally attended an event that I didn't know, and I was looking out for her. But I knew that the TikTok one, who is all Nazi affiliated and
oh yes,
or really fascisty or whatever.
Yes.
Lives in New York.
Right.
And so I was just in New York at Witches Fest, a pagan fair, which is a real I told you a little bit about it. It's a real it's all over the place. It's a street festival that just sort of happens in Astor Place. And you might say, just on the street, and the answer is yes, just on the street. And they get the permit, so they block off, so you can't drive cars on that part of the street, but the cars drive by near it. And so yeah, you're just sort of on the street. And it's like a real. I'll say this. I'll preface it by this. I have a great time doing it every year. I do love to do it.
Sure.
It is a wild time. So the first year that I did it, so I do it with my podcast, Psychic Friendz. I have a psychic advice podcast. It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek psychic advice podcast. And so I had a friend who was involved with it, and they're like, oh, you should submit the podcast. So I did, and they invited us to come do a live episode of the podcast. And I said, great, that sounds great. And so the first year we did it, which was last year, they were like, all right, well, you're going to podcast from that booth. And I was like, that's great. Is there like a PA system? And they were like, no. I was like, cool. Are there maybe chairs? And they're like, no to that too. So no chairs, no PA system, just kind of us in a booth, just doing it. And so we did it. And that was great because a man came off the street who was not there for Witches Fest, but he was in Astor Place on the street. And so this guy comes up and he's trying to talk to my co-host about her bag, the design on it. And we're like, hey, we're doing a podcast. And he's like, oh, great. And so he just sits down and we're like, okay, cool. You just listen to the podcast. And so the format of the podcast is Rosa and I are in a number of psychic advice Facebook groups where people request free psychic advice. And we try to find the most, just the funniest questions. And then we try to do our best to answer them on the podcast. And so one of the questions was, has anyone ever died and been to heaven and then come back? And I say that out loud, and this man who sat down raises his hand, and I'm like, you died and went to heaven and came back? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah. He's like, I OD'd. And so I was in the hospital and I OD'd and I died. But he did something with his wrist, and also just like they defibrillated him back or whatever. And I was like, amazing. What was heaven like? And he was like, so, he was like, it's really scary. He's like, here, like all the people who want to get you, they actually get you. And it's just like, it's really scary. And you're trying to get away, but they get you. And I was like, I can't be the one to tell this man that he was in hell, right? Like I can't, because you can't, you can't be the person to break that news to another person. That you can't. But also, I long for the confidence of this man to have a very scary death experience and to come back and be like, wow, heaven sucks. I've been doing everything so good on my part of things, but heaven, let me tell you, just to come back and be like, yeah, it's so hot and there's a guy in a pair of red pajamas. He just gets you with a big fork the whole time. And I gotta say, heaven could really use some improving. But
how amazing. And that it was just like random person on the street,
just not even there for Witches Fest, just walking by. And so like that's the vibes of Witches Fest. And the thing you have to know also is that they do book full bands. So there's like a DJ and his whole thing is like head to toe white capris, white hat. He's got a very like Miami DJ vibe, but he's just out in Astor Place just blasting like, you know, Born This Way or whatever. And then every now and then they'll stop the DJ and bring in like a death metal band, and so the vibes are just, they're all over the place, and it's a little bit of a sensory nightmare, but I do enjoy it.
Of course.
Yeah. But so this year, I think I was like, oh, I know that fucking what's her name lives in New York. So I was like, I wonder if she'll stop by. Yeah. And I was looking out, but I missed it because a bunch of Christians with signs came, with signs and a megaphone showed up, and they started doing their whole thing. And so we got very distracted trying to get the Christian with. It was a whole thing. It was a whole bit. I was wearing I was wearing a shirt. There's a professional wrestler named Danhausen whose dad is actually a magic practitioner, I think a witch.
Oh, cool.
So Danhausen dresses, he does face paint, sort of like the Pazuzu makeup from The Exorcist. And so he's a fun demon character. And I was wearing a shirt with Danhausen on it, and one of the Christians was like, that shirt is disgusting. I used to worship him. And I was like, you used to worship Danhausen? And she was like, I used to worship the devil. And I was like, this is a man who puts on face paint and wrestles on television. This is very
right. I mean, clearly that person's devotion to the devil isn't that great if they mistook them for a wrestler.
That's always a crazy one when the Christians are like, that used to be me. I used to worship the devil. And I was like, tell me one thing you did. Tell me one. Yeah. Elaborate to me on one piece of devil worship that you did.
Thank you. Exactly. Yes. Right. Can you give me a little more than just, ooh, the scary, like, oh, I was in touch with the dark side. It's like, did you just watch the X-Files? Like, because that doesn't matter. Yeah.
where are all these practicing Satanists come from that they're just suddenly just sprung into being part of the religious right?
Exactly. It's always so funny to me, because I periodically will go through like binging Best of the Worst, and they have this one episode where it's a video, and I think it's for police, and it's like how to spot witchcraft and satanic stuff, you know, and it's clearly, you know, made by a Christian group, and the guy who's their expert makes all these claims about how he used to be a devil worshiper and things like that. And it's like, again, as somebody who's been steeped in weirdness and esoteric stuff and occult stuff for so long, I'm like, really? Yeah, because I don't even practice, and I know more than you.
Yeah. Surely they would be somewhere, right? Like, what is that?
Yes.
Where are they? What are they doing? Because all I hear is people who are like, "They used to be me." Okay, when did you?
When?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. Where was this cabal? Like, yeah. Because I remember, because a friend of mine, I guess former friend who's a Christian, once told me, like, oh yeah, all the Satanists are in Southern Illinois. Like, what? Really?
Oh,
how do you know?
Yeah.
B, where?
Yeah.
C, what are they doing?
That would be so funny.
Right. Like just imagining like street signs that are like, you know, nothing suspicious here. Keep driving.
Yeah. Well, that's how like that's how all the stop signs are upside down. That's how that's why I get very I appreciate sometimes what some of the those the organized Satanism that's not actually a belief in a thing, but is more of a sort of posturing response to right-wing Christianity. I can appreciate it a little bit, but I also do think that those sorts of things do sort of feed into satanic panic, whether or not they intend to or not. I think that a lot of times because ultimately also just a lot of those things end up just sort of being edgy atheists who want to push it a little bit further.
Yes.
But I do think they feed into some of the see, look, there are actually Satanists. And it's kind of not in the way that, not in that way.
Right, exactly. And again, I've had so many conversations, especially through this podcast, with ex-evangelicals, and it's that sensibility of if it's not Jesus, it's the devil. And any kind of pushback is seen as demonic anyway, and demonically influenced. And then as soon as you're I'm a Satanist, it's oh no, see, they're real. It's
exactly
when you can't, again, that trickster in me enjoys fucking around with people sometimes.
Totally.
But when you're dealing with literalists, it gets a little dicey.
It's sort of it's a bigger, I mean, it's a bigger point that I struggle with a lot as a person who writes and makes things and does things, where I get scared sometimes that I think maybe people, Americans specifically, are not capable of understanding media. Do you know what I mean? Where
Yes.
you can put George Lucas in an interview where he's the rebels are an explicit stand-in for the Viet Cong, and the Empire are explicitly modeled after America, and people be no, that I'm just gonna ignore that and keep watching this movie. It's no, that was
right, when you have the author telling you what the literal subtext is, and you're actually no. The literacy comprehension, media literacy, for sure. It's such a huge issue. I mean, it's every time I see somebody complaining about Rage Against the Machine, that's the funniest one to me. But also a friend of mine is also a huge Nine Inch Nails fan, and found this group for conservative Nine Inch Nails fans. It's did you miss that one album? Because that was pretty that was text. That wasn't even subtext.
Yeah.
And again, my favorite comeback is what machine did you think they were reaching against?
Yeah. just the Terminator one. It's the I don't know if you've watched it all. The Boys is a show that's on.
No.
I like it a lot. It's very edgy, and I don't traditionally like edgy things. It's very edgy. It's really gory, but it's also edgy with it sets its sights on right-wing stuff and also centrism. And I think there's a lot of people who are they take shots at both sides, and it's they really don't. They don't make fun of any real leftist ideals. They make fun of the sort of corporate, pink washing and stuff like that. So people will be oh, look, they're making fun of gay people. It's no, they're making fun of a big corporation putting a rainbow flag on something, which is a different thing.
Yes.
But they're sort of the main villain of the show is your evil Superman type. And what's wild to me about this show is you have people who are no, that guy's great. People who are watching the show being no, that's the good guy. And it's no, it's sort of a very explicit commentary on fascism. But people, Americans specifically, and I think this happens elsewhere, but I think Americans are so sort of susceptible to the sort of the propaganda that usually sort of is backing up this country, is very it's sort of baked into so much of media, just fascist imagery and so on, that I think it can be hard, even when something is hyper explicit of this the bad guy and he's a fascist and he's wearing an American flag as a cape, that Americans are but he's got an American flag as a cape, so he's
automatically good. Yeah,
he's the good guy, right? And he's Superman.
Was that the whole Homelander discourse that was
That's
like
Homelander.
on
Yeah.
Twitter? Okay, yeah, because I
Totally.
saw that show up, and then I saw like the subreddit where it's like, we don't
Yeah.
get political here, and it's like, this whole
Yeah.
show is
Yeah.
political. What are you
Uh-huh.
doing? Yeah.
It's wild. And the thing that makes me distrust it a little bit is that it is an Amazon original. And so, anything Bezos is making, but like for an Amazon original, it's crazy how much it really does it really does, and it's depressing, but it really does sort of accurately depict sort of America's headlong sprint into fascism in a way that's like, I don't know, I've enjoyed it a lot. Again, it's edgy and it's gory and it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a good, and I like Carl Urban a lot. I'm a big fan of Carl.
Good,
Urban.
yes.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. It gets it's kind of terrifying. Again, as I've talked to you in DMs, I've mentioned on the podcast, like to have grandparents who like grew up and dealt with the immediate direct consequences of fascism, came here, and then just a couple generations later, you have people who either don't understand what the consequences of this are,
Totally.
or just actively supporting it as if they will be protected. Like that to me is so it's again not a surprise that media literacy is so bad.
Totally.
When people can't even really make sense of the actual political situation that is happening in front of them.
And so much of that, I think, is that and I think we're seeing the sort of like the steroids version of it, with people banning any sort of book that any sort of book that covers slavery or anything like that. I think we're seeing the sort of like the really souped up version of it. But I think about the what stuff that I consumed as like school and stuff like that from an early age, and I look back on it, I'm like, oh, this has been like it's propaganda all the way down. And that's just on the education part. Even outside of media, I rewatched Predator 2 recently.
Oh, fun.
A movie that I've traditionally, in the past I was like, oh yeah, Predator 2, it's great, Gary Busey is in it, it's whatever. And that's some of the most egregious propaganda I've ever seen. So the movie, Danny Glover is he's like a rogue cop, and he does whatever he's got to do because he's on the side of justice. And his whole team is about like beating up reporters, hiding stuff, sneaking into places, using like extrajudicial violence. And it's the whole thing is just framed as like, these are the good guys, don't worry about it, they got to do the thing that they got to do to beat this evil alien, and also these ethnic stereotypes who are selling drugs.
Right.
But it's crazy because it's just like, you think back and say, oh, Predator, totally, it's a fun Predator 2, it's a fun movie, but it's like propaganda is so baked into everything. It's wild to sort of re-look at old media from that lens.
Well, of course. And again, I'm a 90s kid, but I grew up watching 80s movies too. And again, when you are a kid, you typically don't have that political awareness of what's happening. You're just like, oh, cool, fun action movie.
Totally.
Like it's intense and it's an adventure. And then you watch it with open eyes later, and you're like, oh, Reagan was just like on this, and immediately they're like, guess what? Here's how we radicalize people.
Absolutely.
By making all of these heroes. I mean, the same with like Lethal Weapon. Like that trope has existed for a long time. And like, oh yeah, they're the good guy, but they don't play by the rules, and they beat everyone up, especially people of color. Like, well,
even like, even back into like, your Dirty Harry or your all of every John Wayne character. And it's wild. It's wild how like thoroughly baked into just like the idea of media. And it makes sense when you think back on like, how much of the original Face of American cartoon stuff is just like full on, hey, these are minstrel shows, hey, this is war propaganda and stuff like that. But it is sort of, I worry about that again as a person who again makes things and writes things and tries to do stuff, where I'm like, yeah, I have to like, it just feels like at this point you have to put like a Star Wars scroll on the front of it that's like, this not for Nazis, is this one. You can't
you can't take this.
Please don't identify with any of these characters. they aren't for you.
Exactly. Or these are the bad guys and we
Right.
think that they're bad.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, especially like that was the Northman or whatever.
Right,
Which was what like that's Macbeth, I think, right? That's Macbeth, but it's the like the original myth it's based off of. And it was a movie where I was like, there sure it's a lot of white people in this Viking movie. It's only white people in this Viking movie. And I was like, I'm curious how sort of explicitly anti-fascist they're going to make it. And I guess not at all. And I was like, okay, well, and I'm not saying Eggers is, has bad politics. I don't think Eggers has bad politics at all. I think Robert Eggers, as far as I can tell, has good politics, but it's almost one of those where like, if you're going to make a movie about Vikings, like you really got to go above and beyond to be like, it's not for you.
That it's so funny because, when I read that the whole idea of show don't tell was specifically like a CIA infiltrating creative spaces in order to be anti-communist. And like now I understand why communism was all like, let's tell.
Yeah, totally.
Because otherwise people miss the point and they skew anything to kind of undergird there's no room for nuance, especially when you see the rise of fascism. You have to be explicit about what everything is and what you're meaning to say with it. Yeah, it's a little terrifying.
It's scary for sure. Especially because it's like I just wanna make fun art with my friends.
Right.
And that's the goal in general. But it is for sure scary.
Of course. Of course. I know. I've seen your TikToks. You just want to go and investigate different types of boys at the supermarket.
I want to find the boys at the supermarket. I want to talk about minor league baseball mascots. I've been trying to figure out how to I went to my first minor league baseball game on Sunday. I went to see the Brooklyn Cyclones, and it was very silly.
Great.
I've been trying to figure out. I want to figure out how to take like the paranormal stuff we go out and do and put it in TikTok form. Or part of me just thinks maybe it's not even, it's new, and just like that's just a different thing that I do. Because I've tried. We had a very cool, we went out, so we go out on Wednesdays, the Liminal Earth has the whole WUFA Wednesday. So we go out over here and we take some friends out to this like really cool little hilltop, and we do an Estes stuff. And we had a wild one a couple weeks back where like, I think I was plugged into it, and someone I didn't know they were going to do this started asking about a cousin of theirs who had just passed away, who I guess had shot himself. And they're talking about it for a little bit, and I start saying like, and I had no idea they're gonna bring this up, and I start saying like what I'm hearing, I'm coming back like, he's watching, and something about he's got a gun, and then like I said he sees, or he's like he's there and he sees you, and there's a beat, and then like a loud like sounds like a gunshot in the back, could have been a car backfiring or fireworks or whatever, but it's like the sound of a gunshot.
Yes.
And I was like, that's crazy. Like, we got to put that out. And I was like, just TikTok feels like such a weird place for it though,
Of course. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's hard to figure out, like, again, how to find your community for that stuff. For me, especially now, like paranormal stuff is just a part of who I am. And I feel like it's part of my creativity. But some people, they just want to see the jewelry. They just want to see chainmail. They just want to see whatever. It's like, okay, but this is a cool thing I do too.
Yeah.
And had a really cool experience. Like, yeah. So yeah, I get that. I do enjoy seeing, like, I feel like Liminal Earth has like figured out how to create like accessible weird stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, I'm I feel like some of that audience comes for me after, once, and I've talked to you a little bit about this. So I shot the pilot last year, and it's just been like, there's been a lot of stuff just in terms of the editing, and just the person who was doing editing at first was like really, really busy and has a lot of stuff going on, but I've got it in the hands of a different person now, editing wise, and that's going great. And I think we're getting closer to having at least a trailer to sort of put up and to sort of show people. But I do think when that's out, it'll be a better, like, people will be like, why are you talking about, mascots or whatever? And the answer is because mascots are funny. But
yes, they are.
But I do think sort of it'll, I think in terms of why people will be there, it'll make slightly more sense when that's sort of more public front and center.
Of course. Yeah. That's the thing too. You kind of have to make that like declarative state, again, talking about text versus subtext and people not being able to put ideas together. Just like, I'm interested in para-weird stuff. Here are these cool people who are doing this. Like, this is why I care. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm excited though. We shot some just like some B-roll stuff while we were in the city last, just because I was there with Rosa, who, again, we always jokingly call each other twin flames. We actually do have a very fun sort of backstory. We met in New York. We were both doing comedy. And then after we met and became friends, we found out that we're both from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area originally. We lived in the same exact apartment complex at the same time as kids, which is wild because the San Francisco Bay Area is not small.
Right.
It just had a lot of stuff. I think we discovered it because there's a pet store that no longer exists, very sad, called Wet Pet San Pablo. And their TV commercial was a rap about the wet pets, and we both were like, oh yeah, Wet Pet San Pablo. We know all the words to Wet Pet San Pablo. And we're like, wait, no, how? Yeah. But we were in the city, doing the Witches Fest, going to the Giglio Street Market, which or Street Festival, which if you're ever in New York, I recommend. It's once a year, I think. And it's like this weird, it wasn't a church thing at first, and it has been taken on by the church. But originally it was about some guy who like volunteered to save a little boy or something. And so they threw him this whole festival. And now it has sort of become this thing about honoring your elders. But what it actually is now is in Williamsburg, they set up a bunch of carnival rides and they set up a bunch of little food vendors. And there's an old man named like Sal Verano, and he just sings like ABBA songs and Sinatra songs and just sort of whatever to like YouTube karaoke tracks. It's great. Oh, they do I can't recommend it highly enough. I'm not saying it right. It's not Giglio, but we call it the Giglio. It's like Giglio or something like that.
Yeah, of course.
However they say it. But yeah, Giglio Street Fest. It's one of my favorite. I don't smoke cigars anymore. I will smoke a cigar at the Giglio whenever I go.
That seems like the place for it, just by the way you described it. Yeah, exactly. They give you a cigar as soon as you show up.
Yeah, they hand you a cigar, they light it, exactly. And then they put you on a Ferris wheel that goes too fast and makes bad noises, which ideal.
That sounds like a wonderful day.
Oh yeah, no, it's the best. So you came into this very confident about pronouncing the last name, and I didn't know that you were also Polish.
Yes. Oh my God. Okay. Yes, my grandparents grew up in Poland, like proper farm folk that grew up in tiny little villages, came here after World War II, and very much like helped raise me, very much informed my childhood, my sense of the world, my epigenetic terror about fascism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about you?
So I'm first generation Korean American, and I think fourth or fifth gen Polish, and then there's Irish and French in there somewhere. I was told from a very, very young age that I had a great grandpa who fled the Nazis and was sent to New York as like a little kid and had to like figure his way out. But then I also like, just in terms of like unreliable narrator of my family. I don't have any idea. That's the story that I was told. That's like, I think colors a lot of my own thoughts about fascism.
Yes.
I think it's true. I don't know if it's true so I don't talk to any of my family anymore, if that sort of gives you a hint as to why I started questioning, like, I don't know that one either, you know? So I don't have any idea. I think so. That's what I've been told from a young age.
Yeah.
But I've never, people are either very unconfident about trying to pronounce it, or they're very confident and wrong. And I did just learn, I learned this is actually disheartening that I just learned. So my first name is Dash, but it's Dashel, is short for Dashel.
Mm-hmm.
Which I will say is the least cool part about me, is that that's not like a cool non-binary trans name that I picked. I was given that by my parents. So they called it early. They were like, give this kid a cool trans name. So Dashel, but it's from the French de ciel, which is like from heaven, right? And so Kwiatkowski is like child of Flower Town. And so from heaven, child of Flower Town is what the name means. And that's the worst, I think. It's, you know what I mean? Like that's like a kid named Heavenly, or you know what I mean? Where it's like, oh, really? And so like you hear terrible.
See, and I'm just like, when are you starting your cult? Because that is a cult leader name.
It's a cult name.
It's a cult name, but you didn't come up with it. It was given to you. Again, this is you need to start a cult. Make it happen.
Yeah, I just anything, you know what I mean? Anything. At first, because I was like, oh yeah, there's a town called Ciel, and my friend was like, no, Ciel just means sky, and I was like, shit, you're right. No, that's true though.
I know.
I do think I'm the only Dashel Kwiatkowski on the planet. I think that's. I don't think that there's another one.
I think so. I'm pretty sure. Yes, I can't imagine.
I did find another half Asian person who on Tinder, and his name is Dash, and I'm upset about that. That seems not allowed.
But is that their name, or is that their, you know?
See, I don't know. I don't know. I'm unaware.
So since you're also Polish, and since you are also intentionally, as I am, alienated from most of
yes,
because what you're talking about, that like, oh, we're just not going to talk about these incredibly important things.
Yeah.
Or we just tell these occasional stories, but we don't actually get into like what actually happened. Like my grandparents had, like, my grandmother had several siblings.
Yeah.
Only talked to, I think, one or two of them. So I think once told me, because I had to ask when I was a teenager. I was like, so tell me about these people who you grew up with, right?
Yeah.
And my grandfather also, like, 3 brothers and a sister, never saw any of them. They never talked about, I think my grandfather mentioned his sister a couple times. It's, and like, to grow up and then like in college, meet friends who like could name all of their extended family. Like, oh, that's a thing that people do? Because I just thought you just go hide in the woods and you just don't talk to those people anymore.
My partner has a little brother who is like, whole thing is doing the big family genealogy and figuring out like all these people, and he's got like a whole like tree set up, and I'm just like, that's crazy. That's I mean, cool, but that's crazy.
Totally. Yes. I mean, I'm interested because so like the one brother that actually met my grandfather's brother, I'm friends, like their kids, his kids were like the only people my family like kept in touch with, you know?
Yeah.
And they did some apparently before he died, he did some genealogical research. So even though like they grew up in Poland, because the name, you know, Valiuko, that is not a Polish name, really.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
And so I think they traced it back to Belarus.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it's like, I don't, like, again, they did this research and then
Yeah.
it just like blew in the wind. Like, it's so
Yeah.
strange to kind of be unmoored in that way.
I've been looking into, I think when I started getting into weirdness and strangeness, I started thinking about like, okay, well, I'm very interested in a lot of practices, but like what practices sort of are mine culturally, what practices sort of are in my history. And it's interesting, I think, before, and this is a whole other thing where like I get very bummed out at how much of a Christian nation Korea is, just because like it used to have its own, cool beliefs and it sort of doesn't anymore. But a lot of the sort of the beliefs that have survived have so much to do with ancestors and sort of ancestry. But my mom was illegally adopted, so I've like, and we don't know anything past that, so I don't have any idea, you know what I mean? And it's just this weird thing where it's like, how do I sort of find even or look for like who are these ancestors of mine to even reach out to, which is it's interesting. It's interesting to sort of feel sort of like it's almost like a metaphysical roadblock in between me and this practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think most people think about this. Like one of my friends, like professional connections, like she's also a Korean adoptee and knows nothing, like has tried to do some research, try to reach out, but like so much of that is just closed off to her, and she doesn't even know her exact birthday because of that. She has kind of a range, and has like developed like a personal sensibility that kind of has reconciled with that. But yeah, like when you are, because of political and other weird things, you don't have access, and you can only do the best you can with any of it. Like, I mean, in Poland, so much of pagan culture got quashed because of the Catholic Church. I think I have like one little book somewhere in my bookshelf, and it's not very thick because it's kind of just basic. This is what we think. These names survived. Practices might have looked like this. Gods might have been connected to these things. Like it's the idea of like assemblage, and just being kind of okay with, I'm never going to have a complete picture. To reconcile with that, I think is hard, because some people can go back and again, like trace their genealogy and trace all these other things. It's like, my people are displaced. Like,
fully.
Yeah,
and it's sort of I sort of like I get into the idea of like, and I think Melanated Magician on Twitter was talking about something about contemporary practices versus like what are the old practices were. And if you're looking to honor a specific god or a specific deity, like you don't have to necessarily do it however is written about in an ancient text. You can sort of do what sort of feels like your modern equivalent, but even that I think is sort of, and I love that for like the deities that I like, but even that thinking about how to sort of fit that framework into the idea of like ancestry work or anything like that, where it's like, I still don't know. I don't even know who these people were.
That's it. Exactly. You don't know what groups they were a part of, what they believed, like any of that. Not even a vague sense, At least I have a vague sense of like Belarus at some point they migrated,
Totally.
But that even then it's vague. And I think that's why people are like, now that I'm thinking about it, like the appeal of that Reconstructionist kind of thing.
Totally.
Like, oh, here is a thing that I can connect to, even if it's a fabrication. I'll just pretend it's not a fabrication because this is a real thing that I can hook myself into, because it is hard. Like people talk about again, we both follow plenty of weird people on Twitter, and they've got cool ideas, and that idea of trying to or adopting ancestors that aren't necessarily biologically yours, right? Like kind of like spiritually, who are your ancestors, and connecting with them that way. Again, it's a little hard if you want a little more information.
Totally.
Yeah.
I also I see that one. I see I think I've seen some people do versions of that where I've seen white people do it. And I'm like, oh well, okay, well, okay, hold on. Just take just a second before you kind of
there are a lot of cringe takes on the timeline that don't have any sense of critical race theory.
Yeah. I always like to imagine when stuff like that happens, I almost sort of imagine it. And this is not how I conceive of the afterlife at all, but it's just funny for me to think about like someone who, experienced a world that was, extremely hostile to, their belief system, and they were, killed or persecuted for believing a certain thing, and then generations later some white person who's not related to them just reaches out. I almost think of it like when you get like a friend request on Facebook and you're like, the fuck is this? Like
literally, yes. I don't know you, bye.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I always I get a little nervous when I see those takes on the timeline, because I'm like, don't take what isn't don't take what isn't yours,
And I think that's the one that's crazy to me too, is like, there are a lot of really cool and interesting, like, cultural practices in all of the European stuff. Like there's so much cool like Irish and Celtic stuff, and there's just so much cool stuff that you could go into, and people are like, but I want white sage, and you're like, no, but that's the one that there's other ones that are yours and you can just do.
There are so many others. Yes, I know. It's like all it takes is for you to do a little bit of just a little bit of research. You don't even have to do that much. Like Google will help you. Like first page results,
it's there. Yeah,
it's right there. Like find out what is native to those regions.
Yeah,
even if you don't necessarily know like okay, like because a lot of druidry and things get kind of again also reconstructed,
of course,
but you can look at a particular plant and then look at the similarities to other plants that are in that region, and then say like, oh, hey, I can actually use pine, or I can use, some sort of bark, like of a particular tree. There are other options.
And I think so much of it too is like, I see people sort of get on this, like, you can never practice any sort of faith that's not, and I don't think that. And I've seen, I've seen stuff where someone's like, oh yeah, I've been living in this other country studying under this healer for 25 years and now I'm practicing, and I'm like, yeah, that works because you earned it and you worked on it, you know what I mean? And like someone who's part of it was like, oh yeah, let me teach you this thing. And I think people get this very like, oh, so no one can ever do whatever, and it's like, no, you can you just have to, it's it is almost like being like, oh, so I can't just fly a plane, is that like, and you're like, well, no, you have to learn how to do it first.
Oh my God. Oh, that is such a perfect analogy. Oh my God. I'm going to be using that now, and I will be citing you, I promise. Because yes, again, with the internet, with the accessibility of information, it is so easy for people to say, oh yes, I'm this. I mean, even like binge watching shows, like I used to binge watch like Battlestar Galactica, and there's a point to this, I promise.
It's a great show.
Yeah, I loved it.
Yeah.
Binge watched it. They're like, I remember when they were doing it was for the final season, and they were like auctioning off a bunch of props, and like there was a competition to like be the co-host for this auction. Okay. And I found out after the fact, and they showed like you had to answer trivia questions. Every single trivia question they asked, I answered. Like I just like, but could you, if you ask me now about that show, I couldn't tell you because I
Right.
just inhaled it
Totally.
and then again into the wind.
Yeah.
Like it's gone now.
Yeah.
Whereas there's stuff that like again like anime I saw when I was in my teens that I had to fight for, right?
Yeah.
And get fan subs on VHS. Like when you have to like work to find things and study and get it. I can call myself an anime fan even if I haven't like watched any new anime in a while.
Yeah.
Because I did that work. I'm not going to claim Battlestar Galactica because I don't remember much, you know?
Yeah.
And like, yeah, with a religious practice, like, okay, are you just picking something up because it's easy for you to pick up and because no one has told you you shouldn't pick that up?
Yeah. No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I think that there's part of it is like, you know, you hear about something cool. And I think it is hard for people who have had every piece of media catered to them where like they see themselves in a Luke Skywalker and they see themselves in a Indiana Jones and they see themselves in all these characters. And so when they see something that is a closed practice, or even if it's not even a full closed practice, if it's just like, you know, the ethnic practice of a group that they're not a part of, and it's so easy, they've learned to sort of see themselves in everything, that they can say like, oh, I relate to this because I like that animal, or I like that color, or I like that thing. And then the second part of it is when someone's like, oh no, you can't, and it's like, this is a whole class of people who have literally never been told that before. Yes. And I think that it's this combination of things where they're like, oh, I could do that, it doesn't look that hard, like I can do this thing.
Yes. Oh, this is mine. Of course, like everything is mine. Like, so of course this is mine. And the idea of anybody putting up a roadblock and saying like, hey, maybe don't touch this, you know?
Yeah. Or at least come to respect it before you.
Right. See it, like you said, see it as a real thing. Invest time, invest energy, figure out if it's actually yours. Or that if it speaks to you, if you are willing to put in the time and the devotion, as opposed to just saying like, well, I grew up in New Orleans, so of course I'm interested. I'm a voodoo queen now.
Right. Yeah.
That's the biggest like for me.
Yeah.
I'm just immediately like, really? Yeah, do you have any black friends? Like,
interesting. Yeah. And it's crazy because someone will be like, I grew up in New Orleans, and you'll say, do you have any black friends? And they'll be like, and you're like, okay, well, that sounds like no. I get that you don't want to say no, but it does sound like sound like it.
I'm hearing no.
Yeah. I do have to ask. You brought it up. I have to ask, what were your animes that you were going after?
Oh gosh. Okay. So I mean the basics, you know, Cowboy Bebop, Evangelion.
Sure.
Yeah. I got exposed to anime the most random thing. So when I was a kid, one of the local shows had this thing on Saturday nights called Japanimation.
Okay.
And it was a whole bunch of dubbed, like the streamlined dubs that they had gotten they'd licensed to. And so the first like anime that I identified as anime that I saw was this thing called Zillion Burning Night.
Okay.
And so Zillion was a TV show. And of course there was like a tie-in video game and sure. like a laser gun like system also. Yeah. Yes. And so I saw the last 5 minutes of Zillion Burning Night, and spoilers, but it came out 30 years ago, so whatever. And it was this like intense battle scene, and these two guys are squaring off, and this guy is like charging the other one. And this woman in this like super 80s wedding gown with poofy sleeves and veil runs up next to him and like jams a gun into his chest and is like, I can't let you do it. I can't let you kill him.
Yeah.
And then the dude, he looks at the other guy and he's like, take care of her. And he jumps off a building to his death.
Okay. Yeah.
And then of course at the end of it was this like, the bridal woman was like singing this love ballad. I was in. You had me. I got a Scorpio moon. You show me drama like that, I am in. I am in forever.
Yeah.
And then the next week, They showed Silent Mobius.
Okay.
And it, like, that one is super cool. It's inspired by Blade Runner. It's this futuristic anime, entirely female cast. And it's like these future kind of like demon aliens that are invading.
Okay.
And then of course rewatching it recently, I was like, oh, this is like Solomonic magic that is happening.
Yeah.
Like Solomonic blood magic. It's like, yes, I had good taste as a kid.
I think that's one of my favorite anime ones, is like how much anime is just fully like unafraid to use any sort of religious iconography at all. And it's just like there's a certain like, yeah, okay, that one's called Christ, and it do got real big boobs, but don't worry about that because Lucifer's here. And you're like, yeah, cool, this rules.
I'm in, exactly. Yeah, so that's how I got in.
I didn't get to appreciate anime until I was like an adult, because and it was on as a kid.
Yeah.
But being raised by a Korean woman, she was like, we don't like the Japanese here. And I had to really, like, as an adult, I had a lot of like unpacking to do. Like, oh, I was raised with a lot of racism against the Japanese. And you just sort of take it, you're like, oh yeah, okay, cool, of course, the occupation and all that stuff. Which, like, as a Korean adult, I'll tell you, I think not liking the Japanese government is fair, in the same way that I don't like the American government for the numerous atrocities and war crimes.
Right.
But it's one of those things that's like, with the media and propaganda and all, but it's similar to where, like, when you're a kid and you're just raised like, oh, this is what Japan is and this is what Japanese people are. And then as an adult, I was like, oh no, that's a lot of racism actually that I was just sort of fed. And so I didn't get to like watch Japanese cartoons or anything like that. It was like a rare exception to, like, I got to play, Pokemon. That was like the one big thing.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to, like, I didn't watch Dragon Ball Z until I was an adult. I didn't watch Gurren Lagann until I was like, in my actually a couple of years ago, I watched Gurren Lagann for the first time. Gurren Lagann, very fun. Love that.
Yes.
Love that
Yes.
one. But yeah, no, so I didn't get to like really sort of dive into anime stuff until later in life, when I had, again, a lot of like cultural unpacking and stuff to do, which I think is it's interesting how many things that you just sort of take for granted, you never really, if you're not given a space to like look back on it, you say like, oh no, that was actually not all right.
Oh my God, exactly.
Yeah.
For me, like, my grandparents lived through World War II.
Totally.
They had some very specific things to say about Germans and about
Sure.
Jews. And
Yeah.
and it was, and thank God
Yeah.
they didn't start like telling me about the war and about their feelings about this until I was a teenager. And so I
Totally.
could look at them and be like, are you really saying these things?
Yeah.
Are you really saying these things?
Yeah.
Like my best friend when I was a kid was Jewish. I am so grateful they never said anything when I was a
Yeah,
kid.
absolutely.
Because that probably wouldn't have happened in the first place. She wouldn't have been my friend. And so, like, yeah, as a teenager, when you're like, I'm listening to them, I'm like, oh my God, you actually believe these horrible things. Like,
Yeah.
and they've just accepted it. And again,
Totally.
Like I said, I'm grateful that they didn't spew that stuff until later, and I had that removal to be like, oh no,
Totally.
they raised me with it. I mean, again, talk about having to unpack stuff later that you hear from your parents.
Totally. Yeah.
It takes work, but you have to do it so you're not just reproducing all these horrible.
I think a lot. That's the thing that I like a lot about at least sort of the esoteric stuff that I sort of lean into, and a lot of how I sort of look at tarot and other practices and stuff, is there's such a focus on cycles, and the sort of, you get the cycle of death and rebirth and all this stuff. But I think even outside of cycles generally, I think there's so much, at least as a person who comes from a lot of like emotional trauma and childhood trauma stuff, I found a lot of just really value and sort of strength in the idea of what it means to break cycles. And I think when you start really getting into that, it took me a very long time to sort of let go of like anger at my parents. And now it's, it's a point where it's not to say that I have forgiven them. I think that's a different thing entirely. But saying like, I see these two people, and I look at the two people who raised the four people who'd raised those two people, and I know and I get it and I understand why they are the way they are. Like I can wrap my head, I can say like, okay, this parenting leads to this kid, and that kid leads to that adult, and so on. But I think about like, the conscious choice to say like, okay, well, I don't want to have kids. I've had surgeries to prevent it. It's great. A big recommend all around. That said, even just cycles in terms of how I engage with just other people that I know and other people in my life, and sort of the concept of friendship, the concept of how I navigate the world. Breaking those cycles is so it's so important to me, and it has sort of really become like a really important part of just sort of my existence and my identity, to say like, I get it, I see this person, I see why they are the way they are. I do not hold that against them. I would love for them to grow out of it. I don't think that they will. A big part of my worldview, I think that I genuinely think anyone can change and do better. I see people who were neo-Nazis who turn their lives around and then work really hard to sort of fight against Nazism and all that stuff. And I genuinely think, even the worst person can, figure it out and do better and get better. I think the vast majority of people won't, just because it's very hard. But I think anyone can do it. And that's, I don't know, I just think that's very important to me, just sort of conceptually, this idea of what does it mean to not replicate, to not sort of create more of the thing that influenced you or harmed you in some way.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. Because it's that like that to me is real magic, right? It's this internal alchemy, and because you're taking all of that trauma and emotional abuse and deciding like, hey, I'm not going to interact with other people this way. And also I've been in therapy off and on for the past decade, and that idea of, okay, this person, again, releasing expectations of change, always like hope for them to change, because I also believe anyone can change, but I also know that people will only change if they want to change. Based off of my family history, I always see things through like an addiction model, and it's like, okay, if you have not had consequences for this and you have not hit rock bottom, chances are you're going to keep figuring out how to do this. It has worked for you in some way. And again, people, in my experience, most people would rather be comfortable and unhappy than uncomfortable with the possibility of being happy. That's like, I am the opposite. It's like, if I feel I'm in a rut, I'm like, cool, let's trash everything and start again. But that is a practice I started a while ago, and I feel comfortable in it now. Again, when you live in a society that's constantly telling you to just like stick with what you're doing and be small and don't ask for anything. Again, Twitter is full of cringe takes, but I saw something that really kind of struck me, and it was that idea that like, the Christian and GOP kind of politics and the repression against queer people specifically is because they have built their entire lives around suffering, and suffering as a virtue, and sacrificing themselves. And you have a group of people that are saying, I don't care about what social expectations are. I don't care what personal expectations are. This is me. This is who I am. And I'm going to live true to who I am in spite of all of that. And again, just from basic like knowledge of trauma, of course, they want to knock you down as soon as you're saying like, no, society sucks, the rules suck, I'm not going to abide. Doing my own thing. Oh boy, that's where the trouble comes from. Because if you built a life around sacrificing yourself, and an identity around sacrifice, and a pride in for what, like, so yeah, but it takes so much work to see yourself uncover who you are under all that trauma,
Yeah.
that is incredibly powerful. Like you said, to break that cycle, to say, I'm going on a different path, I'm choosing a different trajectory.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most powerful things anybody can do.
I think of it a lot, and the example that I always sort of use when I'm talking to people about this is I feel like existing and sort of interfacing with just people is like speaking a language, right? Sometimes you have to say like, okay, I think that the person who taught me this language taught me that some words are wrong, like taught me the incorrect definition of some words. And so now I'm going out in the world saying words that people think mean a different thing. And so I'm butting up against this. And I think sometimes you have to sort of go back into yourself, into like the foundation that you were built into or onto, and sort of like the earliest building blocks of how you understand. For me, it was as simple as the concept of friendship. Like, what is a friend? What is a friend? What do friends do?
Yeah.
And so for a lot of my early 20s, I was like, I don't know why I don't have friends. I don't know why I don't. And I was a lot of like, you do something for someone and you do something, you earn friendship by doing a thing in a very transactional way. And I think that at some point I sat down and I thought about like, what are friends? What is a friend? And I used to have this like, oh, well, it's because I don't have a childhood best friend, or it's because I never like went to war with someone. I've never formed those tight bonds and whatever.
Yeah.
And now, and I did the thinking about like, what was I raised to think? And I remember like the earliest things my mom would say, in addition to, you're going to be the same as Robin Williams. That's no. And I was like, and looking back, like, it's a lot. But friendship wise, she was like, a friend is a person who listens to you and does the thing that you say. And she would lay out this, like, people have to prove their loyalty and demonstrate loyalty. And now I look back and I'm like, you meant lackeys, like you meant lackeys or followers. And now, now I'm 32 and I have some of the best friendships I've ever had in my entire life, because at some point in my 20s, I was like, oh, that's wrong. Like I learned friend wrong. And I was cruising through life, with a wrong word. And just saying like, oh, okay, like I get it. I understand. Like, let me figure out what friend means to me. Let me figure out like what I want friendship to look like based on sort of what I see around me.
Yes.
And and it was great, because I was like, oh, it's not that you have to know someone from childhood, or it's not that you have to like serve in a war together or something terrible like that. It's just
right.
about existing in such a way that, like, if you want people to have your back, you have to have their back. If you want people to care about you, you have to actually care, and not just like demonstrate care through caring action, but like you have to actually have that experience of care. And it's sort of like I don't know, it's and it all sounds so simple when I say it out loud, but like the going through it and learning, being like, oh, I don't know what this word means because I was taught wrong.
And that's, again, when you're on the other side, when you've been through that process, like you said, it sounds simple, but the whole process is reprogramming your brain and reprogramming your neural pathways. Because I also grew up in this, like, relationships, first, no boundaries in my family. Like again, that kind of like alcoholic Polish family of like, okay, well, totally. You can say, you should and will say everything in the family. Don't say anything outside the family.
Oh yeah.
Exactly. And then this like almost borderline attachment to people, where it's like you're supposed to be completely enmeshed, and if they do something wrong, you reject them, and having to unlearn, and for a while being terrified, because I do have family members with untreated personality disorders. I mean, kind of like clinical, like, oh, is this me? It's like, no, I was just raised to engage with people in a borderline way. As soon as I realized that's what I was doing, I unlearned it. And very similar to you, the friendships that I have right now are the closest and best relationships I've had in my entire life. Yeah. And also like growing up with the sensibility of, which I never believed as a kid. I think that's the wild thing too, like being a kid and you hear stuff and some things you're just like, this just doesn't hit right. I have no frame of reference to say why this is wrong. I just feel something wrong. but growing up in my family was like, your friends are never going to support you like your family does. Blood is thicker than water. Exactly. Yeah. But then being in a situation where they were pushed, and all of them, like none of them came through for me, but I had friends, people that I'd only known for maybe like a year or so, come through for me in incredible ways. I was like, man, you're full of shit. Like if you love someone and they love you, like you don't have to like constantly do things for other people.
Yeah.
You're just there, right? And there's no expectation of balancing the ledger, because that was all, anytime my family did something for me, it got called. Like, call in a favor later. Like, I thought that was a gift. If I knew that was a debt, I wouldn't have taken it.
I wouldn't have taken it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I explain this to people a lot, even just in terms of like going out to eat. When the bill comes, I'm always of the opinion that like, nothing is more stressful to me than like, let's itemize every single thing and figure out who, whatever. I'm like, hey, why don't we all, either everyone puts a card in or one person does it and everyone will, but also like, who cares? And I say a lot, I'll be like, oh, it's going to balance out. I'm not stressed about it. I'll get this one. You'll get one at some point. It'll balance out, because it is so like counter to the idea of any sort of relationship for me to be like, oh, well, you did this much and I did this much and I will need to figure out, you know what I mean? Because it's like, why?
What? Right. Well, again, you're putting numerical values, financial values on a friendship. And like you said, because that's whenever I go out to eat with friends, it's a similar kind of thing where it's like, cool, I'll get this one, you'll get the next one, or like, we'll all just throw in equal amounts. It'll be fine.
Exactly.
Because if you care about somebody, you're also going to have in the back of your head, like, well, I want to make sure this person isn't taking on everything. Like, I want to contribute, right? As opposed to like, they owe me. It's like, no, we're in a community. I want to help. I want to share. I want to include. But learning these things.
Absolutely.
That took time, and it took faith and like grace in myself of like, okay, I was, like you said, I learned the wrong words. I need to learn the right words now. And I can give myself space for that and not kick myself for not knowing it earlier. Yeah.
It's hard, the kicking yourself thing. I struggle with that a lot. That was actually one of the bigger therapy breakthroughs I made in the last couple of years, was like this idea. I used to really fixate on this idea of like what it means to be a good person. And I struggle with it because in my teens and early 20s, I in addition to not knowing how to make friends, I was also just like, I think I was desperately afraid that people wouldn't like me. And because of that, I was very much like, I'm going to be a really polarizing person. I'm going to be much more aggressive and whatever. And that way, if people don't like me, I can say like, all right, well, I'm just a polarizing person. And people, but it's like you set yourself up to be disliked, because it's like, well, I'm going to control it then. And I had a lot of just maladaptive character traits and just the way I engage with people. And I look back and obviously it was like, oh, it's like, that's cringe to me, looking, being like, it's just like a little asshole, basically. But I would struggle with this idea of like, as someone who has been very cruel to people in my past, even if that's not who I am now, and that's not the, how I'm acting, not even who I am, if that's not how I'm behaving now, because that's not the energy I want to put into the world.
Yeah.
I was fixated on this idea that like, but I don't get to call myself a good person because I've been mean or I've been cruel. And what does it mean to be a good person? And the sort of the therapy breakthrough that I've had is I don't think good person is a construct that exists. And I think that's been huge, where it's like, and that's not to say anyone do whatever, because there's no good people, but that is to say that rather than focusing on this idea, I think good person is sort of more akin to like being fit or in shape, where it's like you don't just land at a place and just stay there. For me, it's about, as a very unfit and not in shape person, for me, it's about am I every day you're presented with a series of choices, and they're not always going to be hard ones. Sometimes they're very easy choices, and sometimes they're hard choices. And the question is like, what do you do with that? Like, what are you doing? Are you choosing to create what you perceive to be good in the world at any given moment. And I think focusing on that makes it a lot easier to let go of this idea of like, oh, I have to be a good person. Like, I don't think good person exists. I would like to do good when I am presented with the opportunity and create opportunities to do that, more so than worrying about like this title or this role, you know?
Yes, I love this, because again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of practice. Are
Yeah.
you practicing this thing, right? There isn't just some essential category of good versus evil or good and bad. Like, you are choosing, like you said, what energy to put into the world, what actions to do, the relationships that you want to have, who you want to be in those relationships. Those are choices. They're not just this top down, oh, you're a good person, so you're automatically going to do good things.
Totally.
Like, the things that you do reflect who you are as a person. And I also think inform then, like in terms of, psycho-cybernetics and rewiring your brain. If you are putting good out into the world, if you decide, like it's like you specifically decided, I want to do better, I want to be better to other people, and now you are, and that is probably feels more reflexively the thing to do, as opposed to the cruel choice, right? So that, again, those practices build up, and it's just in that way, those actions become who you are. But it's not like these essential, I'm just good now. Like, what does that mean?
Right. Yeah.
Before I let you go, if there, what projects can we support? Where can we find you online?
I have a podcast called Psychic Friendz. Friends is spelled with a Z, and it's just at Psychic Friendz, I believe, is our Twitter. But that's on wherever podcasts are, all the platforms. That's the big one. When the show has a website and stuff up, obviously that'll be all over my social media. But yeah, mostly just I post everything on my social media.
Perfect. Great.
Thank you so much for listening and or watching. I'm going to put all of the social media links for Dash in the description, as well as a link to Psychic Friendz, so you can listen to that podcast. Dash is also going to be presenting at Pan Paracon. If you're listening to this before September 30th, go to panparacon.com. It's for the schedule and to listen to a live episode of Psychic Friendz. You can also find Personal Pans at Personal Pans on Instagram and on Twitter. Then you can find me at Kali Butterfly. That's Kali Butterfly. Thank you again so much for listening. This was a really delightful conversation, and I hope that you have a playful and curious day.